The night I drove my work rival to the ER and stayed in the waiting room without saying a word, I told myself it was just the decent thing to do. That was a lie. I knew it even then, sitting under those fluorescent lights at 11:40 on a Tuesday, drinking bad vending machined coffee and pretending I wasn't watching the door for her to come back out. My name is Theo Winslow. I was 32, a senior editor at Halcyon Media in Boston, a mid-sized digital publishing company that had somehow convinced itself it was competing with the New York Times. We covered long-form journalism, investigative features, culture, the kind of work that takes 6 months to report and gets read by 300,000 people on a Sunday morning and forgotten by Sunday afternoon. I loved it anyway, and for 2 years the person who made me love it harder and hate it more was Audra Finch. Audra was the other senior editor. Same title, same salary band, same direct report to our editorial director Lawrence. She covered politics and policy. I covered culture and society. On paper, we were parallel tracks. In practice, we were the same track, heading toward the same single opening. Executive editor. The role Lawrence had quietly announced he'd be vacating at the end of the fiscal year. She was not my type of editor, which is to say she was better than me in ways I found profoundly inconvenient. Where I chased voice and texture, Audra chased precision. Her pieces read like they had been stress-tested against every possible objection before they ever reached a reader. My best work felt alive. Hers felt airtight. I spent 2 years telling myself airtight wasn't the same as great. I'm not sure I believed it. We clashed in editorial meetings. We disagreed in writing on Slack, which our colleagues treated like spectator sport. She once told me a headline I'd written was, quote, engaging in a way that prioritizes feeling over accuracy, which is the most polite way anyone has ever told me I was wrong. I once told her a piece she commissioned was technically correct and emotionally inert, which was probably less polite and also true, and also, looking back, a deflection from the fact that her technical correctness made my work look sloppy by comparison. People at the office liked us. Not because we were friendly, we weren't, but because we were honest. And in a media company full of people performing collaboration while quietly undermining each other, two people who just openly competed felt almost refreshing. I told myself I disliked her. That was simpler. Then came the annual Halcyon Press Award dinner in November. The company rented out a private event space in Back Bay, the kind of place with exposed brick and a bar menu that listed whiskey by the origin story. Everyone wore something slightly nicer than usual and pretended the open bar wasn't the main attraction. Audra came in a burgundy blazer over a black dress, hair down for once instead of pulled back. She looked composed. She always looked composed. I noticed because I always noticed, and I was well past the point of pretending that was professional calibration. The night started normally. Awards were given. Speeches were made. Our colleague Dennis told a story about a 2019 story he'd reported that took on new mythology with each retelling. Audra quietly corrected a timeline error in the story while laughing at the funny parts, which was exactly the kind of thing she did that should have been annoying and somehow wasn't. Then her phone buzzed. She checked it under the table. I saw her face change the way a screen goes dark, not dramatically, just all at once. One moment she was present. The next she was somewhere I couldn't see. She stood a few minutes later. Excuse me. No one looked up except me. She came back in 8 minutes. I counted, which I told myself was habit and not concern. She ordered a drink when she sat down, then another that was unlike her. Audra drank the way she did most things, deliberately, with clear limits. 2 drinks at work events, never more. By the time the dessert plates arrived, her third glass was half empty and she was laughing at things that weren't quite funny. Our colleague Pam leaned over to me. Is Finch okay? She's fine, I said. Pam raised an eyebrow and went back to her own drink. Around 10:30, Audra stood to find the restroom. She swayed, one hand grabbing the edge of the table. A couple of the junior staff saw it. One of them, Marcus, who I'd never liked, who smiled too fast when other people had bad days, pulled out his phone and angled it toward her. I was across the room in 4 steps. I put myself between Marcus and Audra, facing him. I kept my voice low. Put that away. He looked up at me with the expression of someone who doesn't understand why they're being told no. Relax, man. It's just, I know what it is. Put it away. He did, not because he wanted to, because making a scene at a company dinner in front of Lawrence was not a risk worth taking, and we both knew it. Audra had steadied herself by then. She looked at me with eyes that were slightly unfocused but still entirely alert in the specific way she had. Like even impaired, she was running a background process evaluating every exit. I know you don't. I handed her her coat. But we're leaving anyway. She stared at me. Then something in her face shifted, very briefly, into something I had never seen before. Not gratitude exactly. More like exhaustion that finally had somewhere to land. Outside, the November air was cold and immediate. Audra stood under the awning of the venue, arms crossed, looking at the street. I can get a rideshare, she said. I know, I'll get one for you. I'm not drunk. I didn't answer that. She looked sideways at me. You're enjoying this. I really am not. That made her look at me directly, which was what I'd wanted, not to score points, but because she had been looking through everything all night, and I wanted her to be somewhere real for a second. The car came. She gave the driver her address in the South End with perfect pronunciation, then pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window and didn't say anything for almost 10 minutes. Boston went by in wet amber and red lights. It had rained earlier. The streets were shining. Then she said quietly, almost to the window, "Don't say anything to anyone." I wasn't going to. A pause. I mean about why. I looked over. You don't have to tell me why. She closed her eyes. My mother is in the hospital. I waited. She had a fall. My brother called during dinner. They think she's okay, but she's 71 and she lives alone in Worcester, and nobody called me for 2 hours because my brother thought I was in a meeting and he didn't want to interrupt. Her voice was flat and controlled, in a way that meant it was costing her a lot to keep it that way. 2 hours. I'm sorry, I said. She nodded once, the way you nod when sympathy is something you've learned to process rather than feel. At her building, I walked her to the lobby. She had her key out before we reached the door, which she held up briefly as evidence of her coordination. I didn't comment. I waited while she got the elevator, and then stood in the lobby until I saw the floor number stop moving. I texted her. Door locked? 3 minutes later, yes. Thank you. That was it. I went home and spent the next 4 hours not sleeping, thinking about the way she'd said 2 hours like it was a verdict. I was in the office by 8. By 8:50, someone knocked on my open door. Audra stood there in yesterday's blazer, a different shirt underneath, hair pulled back too carefully, like she'd done it 3 times to make it look right. Her face was pale. Her eyes were dry, but only because she'd been forcing them to be. I could tell from the way she was holding her jaw. For the first time in 2 years, she didn't look like my competition. She looked like someone who had been awake since 3 in the morning, arguing with herself about whether to come to work. Did I say anything last night? She said. That I should know about? I stood up. Come in, close the door. She came in. She did not close the door behind her, an instinct to keep the exit clear. I reached around her and closed it myself. Sit down, I said. I'm fine. Her eyes filled immediately and completely, the way eyes do when someone has been refusing to cry for a specific number of hours and the one person in the room who knows what happened says, "Sit down instead of you're fine." She sat. Not across from my desk. She chose the chair near the window, angled slightly away from me, which meant she needed to talk but didn't want it to feel like a deposition. I got her water. She took the glass with both hands and stared at it. You told me your mother was in the hospital, I said. You said your brother waited 2 hours to call you. She closed her eyes. That's it, I said. That's all God. She exhaled. Okay, she stopped. Then quieter. Did I say anything else? I thought about the ride, the rain on the window, the flatness in her voice when she'd said 2 hours, like she was reporting it rather than feeling it, because feeling it was not something she could afford in the back of a car. No. She nodded slowly. Relief, and something heavier than relief. How is she? I asked. Stable. Fractured wrist, mild concussion. She fell on the back porch steps. She'd been asking my brother to fix the railing for 3 months. Her voice didn't crack. She made sure of that. He's driving up today. I'm going this weekend. Good. Silence. She looked at the water glass. I owe you an explanation. You don't, Theo. The way she said my first name stopped me. She had used it before, in meetings and hallway disagreements professionally. But this version had no armor in it. I need you to understand that I know what last night looked like. And I know what it means that you were the one who… She stopped. I just need to know what you're going to do with it. That was what she'd come for. Not forgiveness, not gratitude. She'd come to assess the threat. I sat down in the chair across from her. Nothing. I'm not going to do anything with it. Her eyes met mine. We're up for the same role. I know. Lawrence makes his recommendation in 6 weeks. I know. And you're just, she searched my face. Why? There it was. The same question Nora had asked Miles. And I understood exactly why it was the hardest one, because there was no professional answer that covered it entirely. I thought about what to say. I thought about my father, who had spent 40 years teaching high school biology in Albany, who had had a heart attack at 63 while grading papers on a Saturday morning, and how I had been on a deadline when my sister called, and how I had asked my sister to wait 5 minutes while I finished the paragraph I was writing. 5 minutes. I finished the paragraph, then I called her back. I still think about that paragraph sometimes. I can't remember a word of it. Because I know what it looks like, I said, when someone who holds everything suddenly has too much to hold at once. Audra looked at me carefully. That's a specific kind of knowing. My father had a heart attack 2 years ago. I was on deadline. My sister called, and I asked her to wait 5 minutes. I didn't look away from her. He was fine. He recovered. But I finished that paragraph first, and I think about that more than I want to. Audra was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "You never told anyone that. Why tell me?" I looked at her. The careful posture, the hands wrapped around the water glass, the specific expression of someone who has spent years being unreadable and is now reading me back. "Because you asked why," I said. She looked down at the glass. When she looked up again, something in her face had shifted, just slightly, just enough. My mother was a librarian for 34 years. East Side branch in Worcester. She knew the name of every kid who came in. A small pause. She used to quiz me on the Dewey Decimal System, on car rides. She knew I hated it. She did it anyway. She said it like I was supposed to understand the significance, and I did. Not the Dewey Decimal System. The specific cruelty of parents who push their children in ways that feel like criticism and only in retrospect reveal themselves as love. "She called me a week ago," Audra said, "to tell me she was proud of what I'd built here. She said she'd been reading my bylines online. She doesn't. She's not a big internet person, so I know she'd been making an effort." A breath. And then 2 days later she fell on the back porch and nobody called me for 2 hours. I said nothing. There are people who fill silences because they can't stand the weight of them. Audra had ended careers in meetings by letting silences sit until the other person filled them with something they regretted. I was not going to make her explain herself into a corner in my own office. After a while she said, "I don't lose it. Not at work. Not ever. I know. Growing up, my father used to say that if you cry at work, you've already lost the argument." Her voice was neutral. He was a litigator, 40 years. He meant it as advice, not cruelty. It just became a rule. That's a hard rule. It's an effective one. Not always, I said. She looked at me sharply. "Last night you held it together until you couldn't," I said. "That's not failure. That's just being human for 10 minutes. Her jaw tightened. "I don't get 10 minutes. You do," I said. "You just spent 2 years convincing everyone around you that you don't, including yourself." The room went quiet. Outside, the office had filled up, keyboards, voices, the particular white noise of a media company running on caffeine and mild anxiety. In here, it felt separate from all of that. Then her phone buzzed on the armrest. She looked at it. Her face went still. She turned the screen toward me without a word. A text from Marcus. "Heard you had a rough night. Hope you're holding up okay. Just a heads up, people talk. Might want to keep a low profile before the exec ed decision." I read it twice. Then I looked up at her. Audra's expression hadn't changed, but there was something underneath it that hadn't been there before. Not fear. Something colder. She'd been afraid I would use last night against her. What she hadn't planned for was that someone else already had. "He was the one with the phone," she said. "Yes, and he's framing it as concern." "Yes." She set the phone face down on the armrest. "How much do you think he got?" "I don't know, I got there fast." She nodded slowly. The professional part of her was already moving. I could see it. The shift from "I feel something" to "here is the problem, here is the structure of the problem, here is what needs to happen next." I understood it because I did the same thing. It was not a defense mechanism. It was a skill. The problem was when it became the only skill you let yourself use. "I need to get ahead of this," she said, and stood. "Wait." I didn't move from my chair. "Sit down for one more minute." She looked at me. Theo, you're about to walk out there reactive. That's what he wants. I'm not reactive. You will be in 30 seconds if you go out that door right now. She stayed standing, but she didn't go for the door. Forward me the text, I said. Absolutely not. I'm not pulling you into this. You didn't pull me in. I pulled myself in last night. I said it evenly. Forward it, and let me help you build a record before this becomes a hallway conversation. She stared at me. Then, why are you doing this? Because whatever happens with the executive editor role, I said, I want to earn it. Not because you were too busy managing a smear campaign to interview well. That landed. I saw it. Her posture didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. She forwarded the text. I saved it to my personal email, took screenshots with timestamps, and then sent a message to Camille in HR. 3 sentences, no drama. Can you find 15 minutes for Audra Finch and me today? Potential conduct issue from last night's press award dinner. Written communication involved. Camille responded in under 2 minutes. I have 10:30, conference room 4C. Come through, the side hallway. Audra read the reply over my shoulder. You've done this before. No, I said. I've just edited enough investigative pieces to know how evidence gets built. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. Conference room 4C had no windows. A whiteboard with old marker that someone had given up erasing and the specific energy of every difficult conversation a company has ever tried to make official. Camille from HR was 42, efficient, and had the expression of someone who has seen every variety of workplace stupidity and is no longer surprised by any of it. Audra laid it out cleanly. The dinner, the phone call, the drinks, me driving her home, Marcus's phone, Marcus's text this morning. She did not editorialize. She did not perform distress. She just reported the facts in the order they happened, with the specificity of someone who had been documenting her own professional life as a matter of survival for a long time. Camille listened. Then she looked at me. Were you there when the recording attempt happened? Yes. I intervened before I knew whether anything had been captured. Did you enter Miss Finch's building? I walked her to the lobby. I waited until she was in the elevator. I did not go upstairs. Audra glanced at me. I hadn't told her that part. Camille wrote something. And this morning's text, do you read it as a veiled warning tied to the executive editor consideration? I read it as someone testing whether my personal circumstances made me manageable, Audra said. Flat. Precise. Devastating. The timing and the specific mention of keeping a low profile before the decision makes the implication clear. Camille looked at her for a moment. I'll need to interview Marcus separately. Don't discuss this outside this room and do not contact him directly. She closed her notepad. I'll flag to Lawrence that the executive editor timeline may need to be paused pending review. No discussion of candidacy in connection with last night's events will be permitted. Audra exhaled. Not relief. More like the release of pressure that comes when something that existed only in your chest finally exists on paper. When we walked out into the side hallway, Audra stopped moving. She stood there for a moment with her back against the wall. Not dramatic, just still. That was the right call, she said finally. Yes, I wouldn't have done it without you pushing. You would have, I said. Differently, and later, and with more damage done. But you would have gotten there. She shook her head slightly, not disagreeing, absorbing. Then her phone buzzed again. Another text from Marcus. Not trying to make trouble, just thought you should know. People notice things. I'm only looking out for you, Audra. She showed it to me without speaking. He just sent 2 texts, I said. Establishing a pattern. I know. That's actually good for you. I know. But her face had gone somewhere else. Not the professional calculus, something older and more private. I spent the last 10 years making sure there was nothing anyone could use against me here. Nothing personal. Nothing visible. She looked at the phone. 1 phone call. 2 hours I didn't know about it. And now this. I looked at her. He didn't find a weakness. He found a moment. Those aren't the same thing. She considered that. Then she said, quietly, I'm going to go see my mother this weekend. Good. She's not going to understand why I didn't leave immediately when it happened. Maybe not. I'm not sure I understand either. She looked at me. I've been making these calculations for so long. What can I afford to feel at work? What I have to save for later? That sometimes I don't actually feel the thing until much later. Much, much later. And by then it's been reconstructed so many times it barely resembles the original. I didn't have an answer for that. I just stayed with it for a moment because it deserved that. My father waited until after my mother's surgery to cry, I said. It was a routine procedure. She was fine. He sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot for 40 minutes because he didn't want anyone to see him. A beat. He told me about it 10 years later, like it was something he still owed himself permission for. Audra looked at me. You're close with your father. Now we got better at it. She held my gaze for a moment longer than felt professional. Then she looked back at her phone. Thank you, Theo. I mean it. I know. I still don't entirely trust that you're not going to be better than me in the executive editor interviews. I intend to be. The corner of her mouth moved. There you are. I drove her to Worcester that Saturday. She hadn't asked. What had happened was, she'd sent me a message at 7:15 Friday evening that said, Worcester General, visiting hours are 9 to 5 on Saturday if you were thinking about it. And then immediately followed it with that was strange, forget it. And I had responded, I'll pick you up at 8:30. There was a long pause. Then, okay. Her mother's name was Nancy. She was in a private room on the third floor with a wrist cast, a television tuned to a home renovation show she wasn't watching, and the look of a woman who had spent 4 days being monitored and was deeply ready to stop being monitored. She looked at Audra when we came in the way mothers look at daughters when they haven't seen them in too long, a whole inventory happening in 3 seconds. Then she looked at me. Mom, this is Theo. We work together. Nancy Finch took me in with the same focused attention Audra had, just slower and considerably less threatening. You drove her here. Yes. From Boston. Yes. On a Saturday. The traffic was fine. Nancy's eyes moved to Audra. Audra's expression was the specific neutral that people deploy when they're hoping a parent won't say the thing the parent is absolutely going to say. Okay, Nancy said, and then very deliberately changed the subject. Audra, the remote is broken again. The morning settled into the particular rhythm of hospital visits. Pillows adjusted, nurses checked, food discussed at unnecessary length, the television volume a constant negotiation. Nancy Finch had strong opinions about current events, mild opinions about the food, and very clear opinions about the railing on her back porch, which her son Dennis had now fixed, but not to her specification. I sat in the chair near the window and listened to Audra talk to her mother the way I had rarely heard her talk to anyone, fully, quickly, with the particular shorthand of people who have had the same arguments long enough that they no longer need the setup. Nancy interrupted, corrected, redirected. Audra pushed back on every correction. It was somehow entirely warm. After about an hour, Nancy asked Audra to go find coffee that wasn't from the floor's drip machine, which I recognized as a 10-minute construction. Nancy looked at me when the door closed. She doesn't bring people to things like this, she said. I know, she hasn't since her father and I divorced. That was 9 years ago. Nancy adjusted the wrist cast on her lap. She decided she was better at operating alone. She is very good at it. It's also made her a little, Nancy searched for the word. Entrenched. She's good at her job, I said. She's exceptional at her job. That's not what I said. Nancy looked at me. She tells you things? I thought about the car on Tuesday night, the word 2 hours and everything it carried, the story about the Dewey Decimal System, some things. Nancy was quiet for a moment. She called me last week. First time in a while that it wasn't scheduled, wasn't checking a box. She just called. She looked out the window. I didn't tell her this, but I was in the middle of something and I almost didn't pick up. And then I thought, what if I don't? She shook her head. I'm glad I picked up. The door opened. Audra came back with 2 coffees and a granola bar she pressed into her mother's non-casted hand. She sat on the edge of the bed and started unwrapping the granola bar for her, without being asked, and Nancy let her, and neither of them commented on it. I watched Nancy reach over and put her casted hand carefully over Audra's. The cast was clumsy and large. Audra looked at it. Then she put her other hand over her mother's cast, steadying it, holding it still, and neither of them said anything. I looked at the window. Some things are not for witnesses. On the drive back, Audra was quiet for the first 30 minutes. The Massachusetts Turnpike was doing its usual thing, beautiful in late afternoon light, miserable in terms of Sunday traffic. I didn't try to fill it. Eventually she said, she told me she's been reading my pieces. I heard. She never told me that before. She told other people. My aunt said something about it once, but she never told me directly. She paused. I think she thought I'd find it embarrassing or something. She didn't know I'd been hoping she'd say it for about 8 years. I didn't say anything. That sentence didn't need a response. It just needed to have been said. A few miles later, my father used to come to my debate tournaments. He never mentioned them either. Never said whether I'd done well or not. I won the state tournament my senior year of high school, and he said, "Dinner?" And we went to dinner, and he asked me about my college applications. She said it without bitterness. I spent the whole dinner trying to figure out if he was proud or just hungry. Was he? Proud? A pause. I think so. I found a clipping in his desk once, after he moved out, a newspaper clipping from the local paper about the tournament. He'd kept it. She turned to look at the window. He just didn't know how to say it. Did you ever tell him you found it? No. Are you going to? A silence. I don't know. Maybe. She turned back to the road ahead. He's not like my mom. He's harder. He built a courtroom face and then forgot to take it off at home. I thought about my own father. The 40 minutes in the parking lot, the 10 years before he told me about it. How the bravest thing he'd ever done, emotionally, was tell me that story at all. People practice being strong until they forget they have a choice, I said. Audra looked at me. Is that something you believe, or something you're saying for my benefit? Both. She looked back at the road. Then quietly, thank you for coming. It wasn't nothing for me either, I said. She processed that for a moment. No? No. My father's in Albany. I don't go enough. A beat. Today reminded me of that. We drove in silence for a while. The kind of silence that isn't empty. The kind that's full of things that don't need to be said out loud, because they've already been understood. As we got back into the city, the skyline starting to show through the dusk, she said, I don't know what to do with this week. What do you mean? I came into your office yesterday thinking you had leverage over me. I left your office in a completely different situation than I planned for. She looked at her hands. And now you've met my mother. And I've told you things I don't tell anyone at work. She paused. I don't know what category that puts us in. I didn't answer right away. We were on Starro Drive by then, the river on the left, the city on the right. I don't think it has to be a category right now, I said. She was quiet. Then, that's a very reasonable thing to say. I have my moments. Don't make me like you more than I already do, she said, and the way she said it, flat, almost annoyed, like she was reporting an inconvenient fact, made it the most honest sentence she'd said all weekend. I pulled up to her building and she got out. She stood on the sidewalk with her bag and looked at me through the window for a moment with an expression I couldn't entirely read. Not unreadable, just not finished. Like she was still working out the sentence. Then she said, same time tomorrow. Work! Same time tomorrow, I said. She nodded once. Then she went inside. The next 4 weeks were not easy to define. Marcus's review moved quickly once HR pulled his messages and confirmed with 2 other colleagues that he had been the one to suggest recording Audra at the dinner. The junior staffer who'd held the phone admitted it directly. Enough had been preserved in iCloud before the deletion for HR to confirm the attempt. Marcus was removed from 2 major accounts, put on a formal improvement plan, and quietly began looking for jobs elsewhere. He was gone by the end of January. Lawrence paused the executive editor process for 3 weeks pending the review. When it reopened, Audra and I were both still candidates. That should have felt like a clean reset. It mostly did, but something had shifted underneath the competition, and we both knew it. The sharpness was still there. She still corrected my assumptions in meetings. I still challenged her conclusions. The difference was that the cruelty had drained out of it. When she pushed back on my ideas now, I believed she was pushing because the idea needed it, not because she needed me smaller. I think she started to feel the same way about me, though she would not have said it that way. One evening, maybe 3 weeks after the HR review closed, I found her in the small kitchen off the 4th floor bullpen at 7:15, standing in front of the electric kettle, looking at it the way people look at appliances when they're not actually looking at anything. You good? I said. My mother starts PT this week. She reached for a mug without looking at me. She's annoyed about it. She'd rather just use the hand. What does the doctor say? That she can either do the exercises or lose 50% of her grip. A pause. She's doing the exercises. She's furious about it. I got a mug for myself. That sounds right. She almost smiled. Exactly what my grandmother would have done. Possibly what I would do. She poured the water. I called her last night, not to check in, just to call. How was that? She talked for 45 minutes about a book she was reading and a neighbor dispute and whether the PT facility has good parking. A real smile this time, small and tired and genuine. It was the best phone call I've had in a while. I poured my own water. We stood there for a moment in the kitchen under the bad, overhead light that nobody had ever fixed. And I thought about the fact that I had known this woman for 2 years and spent most of it at professional distance, and that the truest version of her I'd ever seen had been in a hospital room watching her hold her mother's cast still. I'm going to Albany this weekend, I said. She looked at me. Yeah? I'll call my father from the road, give him some warning so he doesn't have a second heart attack. She made a sound that was half laugh, half exhale. You are. She shook her head. You're terrible at being easy to dislike. I'll work on it. She turned toward the door. Then she stopped. Thea. She turned back. And for the first time in the 2 years I'd known Audra Finch, she looked at me with absolutely nothing professional in her expression. No calibration, no armor, no awareness of who might be watching. Just her. I'm glad it was you, that night. At the dinner. I held that for a second. Me too. She nodded once. Then she took her tea and left. Audra got the executive editor role. She was better in the final interview, clearer, more specific, better preparation on the operational side of the position. I knew it before Lawrence called us both in. And when he told her first and then told me he wanted me to lead a new investigative vertical under the restructured editorial team, I felt something I hadn't predicted. Not resentment. Not resignation. Something that felt almost like relief. Like I'd been trying to win a race without being sure I'd been running in the right direction. She looked at me afterward in the empty conference room, waiting for the old version of me to show up. It didn't. You earned it, I said. She held my gaze. You were excellent, not quite excellent enough. Don't minimize it, I'm not, I said. I just know the difference. She looked at me for a long moment. Then, very quietly, I don't know how to have this conversation without being careful. We can practice. She exhaled something that was almost a laugh. Okay, we got dinner that night. Not a date, not officially. 2 colleagues, recently competitors, who had been through a strange and clarifying 4 weeks and wanted to not be in the building for a while. We went to a Vietnamese place in the South End that she'd been meaning to try and walked there from the office in the cold with our breath showing. She told me about her father, the litigator, the clippings he'd kept, the conversations they hadn't had. I told her about the paragraph. She listened the way good editors listen, not waiting for her turn to talk, actually hearing. We split soup dumplings and disagreed about a story we'd both read in The Atlantic and argued for 40 minutes about a structural edit I'd suggested on a piece she'd commissioned. And at some point, I realized we had stopped being careful without noticing. Walking back, she stopped on the sidewalk outside her building and looked at me. This is a terrible idea. Professionally. Probably. I'm your direct supervisor now. I know. That's a real conflict. It is, I said. We'd have to tell Lawrence. And HR. And we'd have to be very, very precise about what is and isn't appropriate given the structure. She looked at me steadily. You've already thought about this. I've thought about a lot of things in the last 4 weeks. She was quiet. The streetlight caught the side of her face, and I thought about burgundy blazers and rainy November streets and the way she'd said 2 hours like it was a verdict she hadn't appealed. Then she said, I don't want a relationship that requires me to perform. I know. I've done that. It makes you lonely in a specific and irreversible way. I know. I'm telling you this now because once I let people in, I don't. It takes a long time to learn to let them back out, and I'm not willing to do that again unnecessarily. Okay, I said. She looked at me. That's it? Okay? I'm not going anywhere, Audra. That's what I'm saying. She searched my face. Then something in her shoulders lowered, almost imperceptibly, a tension she'd been holding for so long it had probably stopped feeling like tension. Okay, she said finally. And then, come upstairs. I'll make better coffee than whatever you had at the office. I did. We stayed up until 1 in the morning talking, mostly about things that had nothing to do with work. I learned that she could not watch horror movies, but had seen every episode of every season of a certain extremely violent prestige drama and had no explanation for the inconsistency. I learned that she still had every issue of a particular science magazine that her mother had given her a subscription to when she was 12. I told her about the summer I'd tried to learn guitar and given up because my fingertips couldn't handle it. And she told me about the one semester in college she'd thought she might study art history, and how the decision to switch to journalism felt like giving something up at the time and like coming home about a week later. I didn't leave until 2. We told Lawrence the following Monday. Then HR. They were professional about it, largely because the reporting structure required a formal separation of any editorial oversight Audra had over my work, which was manageable and which Lawrence accommodated with minimal drama. It was not simple. We were not simple. We disagreed constantly and productively, and sometimes less productively, and learned over time to tell the difference. Audra's mother finished physical therapy in the spring and sent me a card. Actual mail, a card that said thank you for driving and nothing else, which felt exactly right. My father met her at Thanksgiving, studied her for about 40 minutes, and told me privately in the kitchen that she was the most direct person he'd ever had a conversation with, which he meant as the highest possible compliment. 3 years later, I proposed in the South End Vietnamese restaurant where we'd had our first not date between the soup dumplings and the 40-minute Atlantic argument, because it felt like the right amount of ordinary for a story that had started the way ours had. She said yes before I finished the sentence. Then she told me the phrasing of the proposal could have been cleaner. I told her I'd revise it for the next draft. She said there wasn't going to be a next draft. I said I knew. I just wanted to see if she'd let it go. She didn't. She never does. That's the part I love most. If someone you'd spent 2 years competing against needed you one night and you were the only one in the room paying attention, what would you have done? And have you ever looked up from a rivalry and realized the person across the table was the one who understood you most? Tell me in the comments. If this one hit something, leave a like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.